Hey y'all, we're going to go over the basics of Zbrush so we can get ourselves in there and get some real fun going on. We've been working to max lately like we've done high and low and medium res. We're going to go in the other direction now. We're going to actually take some of this stuff and do it in Zbrush. I don't expect us to be masters of Zbrush by the time we're done with this lesson or anything. This is just to get us started, to get us comfortable inside of Zbrush, and then possibly, depending on how everything goes, bring some stuff in from 3D Studio Max and then do some detail work on it. Now, future, and you'll hear me talk about this, the 3D Studio Max you can work straight in ZBrush for almost 90%, 95% of what you do, and then come into Max for come into Max for a couple of other things. But in this case, we're going to go build off of what you've already made. And some of this stuff is kind of going to be redundant, so some of the stuff we did in our high-res mesh we're going to just do instead inside of here. That doesn't mean you can't bring your high-res mesh in here and do it that way, but we'll get into that anyway. Let's just talk about ZBrush and what it can do, and the basic walk around the side of it. So when we open it up, we get something that looks like this. You'll notice there's grayed out stuff, and there's a couple of random shapes over here. ZBrush works a lot like a 3D program that you're used to thinking about, but it just has a couple of naming conventions that are different. I mean, I could go into 2.5D in the way it's actually built, but let's just get into the basics of it and in a way that you'll understand because you've been working in 3D. So to build something in ZBrush, we can either import it in, but before we even do that, we've got to get out of this mode right here. This is actually a mode where you create objects or bring objects in or defaults to set them up. This is not a place where you can actually do any work. So let me show you what I mean. If I grab one of these and if I hold down and click, you can see there's a bunch of other options, but I'm gonna just click on this first cylinder and I'm gonna click and drag to pull it out. And now you'll see that I have this cylinder, but you'll notice that if I try and drag anything, if I try and work on it or anything, if I go here, it's just gonna keep making all these cylinders. Well, that's because we aren't into the edit mode yet. So once you build your cylinder, you'll be in this once or twice in the beginning, and then that's it. But once you build your cylinder, you've got to go to the edit mode. So let's get rid of that. And to get rid of this and to start over, we just say Control N for new. Pull this back out, and then we push T, not Control T, just T. We push that T button, all of a sudden you see this frame around the outside of your viewport here, and that means that you're working inside of the edit mode, and you'll see edit is also lit up. So to look around on objects once you get into edit mode inside of ZBrush, let me go over the controls of the zoom, the pan around, and rotate and all that. So all I'm doing right now is holding the left mouse button off of the object and just spinning it around, and it's going to flip it around. If I hold shift, it will snap it into any of the main directions. Okay. Sometimes it's easier if we see this floor on. It's not on by default, but I'll turn it on real quick, and you'll see that's the ground. That's basically 0. So if you see that maybe it'll help you. So when I'm turning it around, I'm kind of doing this. If I hold shift, it'll snap between all the views. Now it's hard to tell the view when you're on a cylinder, but you get the idea. So moving around is just off of the object and holding shift. And then let's say I want to, let's see, if I want to pan around, I hold the Alt button, and again, it's all left mouse button at this point. So I'm holding the Alt button and left mouse. Now this is where it gets tricky, and this is where ZBrush is its own special little thing. If I want to zoom in and out, I act like I'm going to pan it. So I've got my Alt and middle mouse button selected. But while I'm still clicking on the left mouse button, I let go of the Alt button, and now I'm zooming in and out. So just to do that again, hold Alt, click the left mouse button, let go of Alt while the mouse button's still clicking, or being held down, and you're zooming in and out. It's a little weird, something to get used to. It's something that we all struggle with, especially going back and forth from 12 programs that we all use different combinations of left mouse button and Alt for that matter. Okay, so moving around in here is more or less like that. Now, what we're working on here is not actually a 3D object. They call them tools. And to get an idea of what I mean by that, if I come down here and I open up this button that says Subtool right below what I'm working on, you'll see that it says that cylinder we've just created, and it's a subtool. So these are going to all be tools. If I duplicate this, it's now two of the same subtools. And I only can work on the layer that is selected. You'll see that they have eyeballs and they have all these other setups and stuff. We'll get to some of this stuff as we get further in. But for general purposes, we can only work on whatever one is highlighted. And in this case, it's the bottom one. The way you can navigate around in here is you can just click on this. It'll go up to the next one or the lower one, or you can use the arrow button. Arrow up and down will jump between them, or if you want, and it'd be easier if they were separated, but you can push Alt and click and it'll select on the one you want. You saw something just pop up there. Well, that's because defaulting, I'm going to delete this other layer here. Yeah, just so I have one. You'll see when I made this, it's called Cylinder 3D, but it's really a polymesh 3D. It's not a sculptable object. Actually, that's interesting that it did. When I duped it, it made it a poly. That's an interesting twist. Let me try this again real quick. This is a new thing to me. When I duplicate it, and they made it a polymesh 3D. Interesting. Okay, so something I didn't know, and there's something that is an interesting point. When I duplicate this, it makes it so it can be modified. But if I don't want to duplicate it, I just want to modify the one I have right here. I have to have this object selected, go up to Polymesh 3D. If it is not a Polymesh 3D, which is interesting that it's ever comes out this way to me, but if it's not a Polymesh 3D, you'll see when I sculpt on it, it says you can't do anything. And when I say sculpt, I mean move the brush at this point, click and drag. We'll get into what the sculpting is in a second. But I have to make it a Polymesh 3D, so I click on Make Polymesh 3D. And you'll see what it did is it just duped it and moved me to another place, because here's my Cylinder 3D one, like I was just in. Wonderful ZBrush. So I'm inside of here, and now I'm working in the Polymesh 3D. So this is where the real stuff happens. This is where it starts happening. Right now, if I push Shift F, we can see the wireframe of this object, much like a cylinder inside of 3D Studio Max. And we can get into how to change those out. But again, I'm trying to get you used to working inside of here. So I'm working in this layer. It's a Polymesh 3D. If I want to rename it, I can just click on Rename and rename it down here. For now, we're going to leave it the same. I'll push Shift F to turn it on and off, and you can see it just clicks this button. It's the same thing. And then I want to change this. So right now, if I do anything, it's not going to have a lot of resolution to work from, because remember, there's not a lot of subdivisions. But it still does it. I'm going to start using my pen a little bit here. So if I use my pen, I want to change something on here. This little icon that drops around the outside of it is kind of like a Photoshop brush tool. If you look at this, it makes the tool like it's moving around, and what I'm actually using for the tool by default inside of ZBrush is this right up here. This is a brush. This is what it defines how it's going to form the shape that you're building. If I click down on this, you'll see I've got a lot of brushes to work from, and there's even more to work from. But in our case, we're just going to do it with the standard for now. If I make it bigger, I can make it bigger by dragging it up down here, and smaller and bigger. In this case, it's the center area, or I can make it bigger this way. The way I do it is, since I'm used to thinking about Photoshop when I started drawing, is I just use the brackets. If you use the brackets, they go bigger or they go smaller. So I'm going to go bigger a little bit. And if I go draw across this with the standard brush, you'll see it just does this. It makes this really modified, simple thing. But it's doing it. It's just not got a lot of polygons. Everything you work on inside of ZBrush is based on the vertices. Every vertice is what gets pulled and pushed. It's not really looking at the faces or anything. It's looking at the verts. That comes down to everything you do. And that's one of the reasons, let me close this. Actually, you won't have this open either. That's one of the reasons right now we're at 482 active points. In 3D Studio Max, when you want to make it more resolution, we just use a turbo smooth or something like that. Well, this is almost exactly the same thing as a turbo smooth. So if I push Control D, which is the same shortcut for divide, it divides it. And you'll see, just like turbo smooth, it smoothed it out because I don't have any hard support edges on here. But that's okay for this. We're just going to do it. So now we're at 1,000 tries, or polys. So if I come in here and I do this, it's a little bit smoother. So if I do it again, Control D again, now I've got 7,000. And if I do this again, it's even smoother. If I control D one more time, I'm at 31,000. And I can get smoother. Now if I take this and make this pen smaller, it'll even be more apparent. So if I come back in and add like this, now I've got it much smaller. Let me back out. If you want to go back to a different version, you hold Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, and it'll just go back to the original. Notice though it does have the rounded edges because it's deformed the main mesh. This isn't undoing, which we'll get into in a second. But with this smaller one, you'll see that it doesn't have a lot to work with. But I can also sculpt at the smaller level, turn it up by going D, 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 and you'll see it gives the resolution based on what I did. Now I can also do it the other way. I can go here, put all this high res stuff inside of here, and then go Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, and it's going to deform it that way. Now this is deformed based on the higher res. Anyway, really in ZBrush, the way I work, or most people work, a lot of people work, is we start with the multi, the dividing it up. But as you can imagine, it'll get pretty fast, pretty big, pretty fast. 31K is not that big, but if I keep going, Control D, now it's times 5, and I go Control D one more time, 500,000, and then 2.3 million, because we're times 4 every time, right? Now if I do this brush, you're not going to see much of a difference. That's the whole point, is that this wasn't needed to get the kind of resolution I wanted for the size of the brush it was set to. Maybe one more. Well, let me do this. Let me show you these up here. You'll notice this little these little dots right here, and they'll get longer and longer and longer. These are your undos. It's kind of cool that you can go Control Shift Z to redo, 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 or Control Z to undo, and you'll see that jump down in the timeline. It's like a timeline. I can go all the way back to here, and it'll go there, and if I go all the way back, it'll even go further. This is a pretty cool little tool. I kind of like this. Sometimes I randomly hit it by accident, but beyond that, it's pretty cool stuff. So let me come back up here. We'll go to 4, where we started. And then I can just start doing more stuff. And as soon as I start doing more stuff, it will either just override it. Now, sometimes when you have a lot of work in there, it'll come and say, you're going to erase the work ahead. Because as soon as I did that one thing, the other pieces disappeared. In this case, there's only a couple, so it didn't care. So again, moving around, sculpting around, all that kind of stuff, all done, and then higher res. Right now, let's talk about textures on here. These are just for visualizing. Now remember, there's a lot of stuff we can do inside of ZBrush, including paint our own textures. But for what we're going to do, we're just going to go ahead and look at these materials on the object so we get a decent feel for what we want. If you want to change your brush, let's say I don't want this simple, this. All I have to do is click here and go and list it out. Or I can say B by pushing the shortcut B. It opens up that thing, and then I just pick the first letter of the brush I'm looking for. In this case, we're going to use Damien Standard, which is right under D, so FD, D, right there, and it says Damn Standard, but it's Damien Standard because it was made by Damien. And if I push D, it'll hide everything but what's in the D's. Now, I've made shortcuts for this, but you're not going to have to worry. This shortcut right here is not what yours is. ZBrush is one of those programs that gets really nitpicky about how close your mouse is and how far off it goes before it disappears. But I can just change it by clicking on that. So now I have this thing called Damien Standard Brush. And if I turn this around and we look at the back side of this, and I will Shift, and then I put Alt to move it. And then I start using this brush. You'll see it's cutting in, and it's a very fine kind of brush, and it depends on the alpha it's used. So let's talk about that part. Let's talk about going in instead of out. Does that mean I can only go in on certain brushes and out on other certain brushes? No. Let me go back to standard, and for me, you would be pushing B, S, and then you'd find the letter for standard. In this case is, and if you memorize it, great, and if not, you can make T. If I do this and I don't push anything, I paint outside of it, right? This is the cool stuff. If I hold Alt and do this, it's now carving into it, okay? If I hold Shift, let me go back and leave that one on there, actually. Let me go back and do this, and I'll do this. If I hold Shift and use that same brush, you'll see this brush change to smooth. When I push Alt, nothing changed. It just went from, it'll actually sub to add. Right now I'm on add. It used to actually show you the icon change when you push the alt button, but it doesn't for now. So I guess they figure you know you're pushing the button. This is just for like turning it on for permanent, more or less. But if I hold shift, it changes the button. Now shift is where you come in and I can smooth anything I want, just like I would smooth clay. If you've worked in clay, you can think about how you would smooth it out with your thumb or whatever. I can make it bigger and it'll smooth it faster and all that stuff. The more area it smooths from, the more it has to pick from. So if I turn this back around, I can smooth a lot of this out. Okay. So I go back to this, and if I push down on the my brackets to make my brush a little smaller, and then I push Alt, it's gonna like that. Now let me make it even smaller and show you something else. There's also the strength of the brush. Now I'm using my Wacom, so the Wacom has some default settings, but we still have overall control. So like this, there's that. I'm gonna come up here and say the intensity right now is set to 25. If I turn it higher and I do this, it's going to be sticking it out further, and if I push Alt, it's going to stick it in further. I remember that was, and you can also click on any of these sliders you see. If you click on that slider and just don't drag it, or even if you disk drag it, you can type in whatever you want. You can type in, push enter on the keypad on the left, or you can say 20 and enter, and now if I do that same thing, you'll see that it's definitely not as deep and definitely not as extruded. Okay, so this is cool. These things right here change how your brush's focus is. So if I come here, you'll see the outside of the brush. The inside circle is the 100%, and out from there, the outside circle is it fades to 0. So if you think of it as, I'm going to change my focal shift all the way to the edge, 100%. Now it's going to have a harder edge because it's going to be drawing the object without trying to soften it. If I go the other way, it's going to be trying to figure out how to smooth that sucker out. It's smoothing basically as you draw. So if we come back to 50, which is this by default, that's great. Now, like I said, there's a ton of brushes, and that's where a lot of people can use one brush. A lot of artists have used one brush, but I like several brushes. I'm not going to get into all the brushes in this case. There's a couple more things I do want to show you before we wrap this one up for the day. I want to show you, let me think about this, how I want to do this. I like dynamic. Okay, so right here you'll see there's another setting called dynamic. There's two school of thoughts on this. Dynamic does this. With a dynamic brush, I have it set to, let's say, we'll put it right now, so it's about, I don't know, 60% of the center of that mass. And if I push the brush, let's do the smaller one. I'll pull it back. All right, if I do this and I draw an S, if I zoom back out and I draw that same S, it's going to be the same size. If I zoom in 100% or really close, you'll notice the brush got bigger. So that means the brush stays exactly the same compared to the object, no matter how close or far apart they are. I actually don't like it that way. I don't mind using it that way if I have to, but I've come to like the dynamic turned off. So if I double click that, it obviously takes my draw size huge up. So ignore that, you just drag it back down. But if I double click it, you'll see it's grayed out. What that means is that now, if I take this brush and I do, let's see, here, jerk. Let's say I do this big, and I just do that. If I zoom in without changing the brush size, you'll see that the brush size physically didn't change. It didn't scale as the object got bigger. It stayed the same size. So now I'm actually painting in more detail. As I zoom in a little bit more, I'm painting in more detail. Pretty cool stuff. I like it. I like it a lot. This is the way I like to work. So I can make things higher res or soften them up by zooming out. I'm basically zooming in and out to soften things up or scale them up or make the brush bigger and carve in more. And then I can come in closer and carve in more detail. And then if I really wanted to, I can come in closer. Now, obviously, this is all going to depend on the amount of resolution you have on your mesh. But now I can do that kind of stuff. I enjoy that way of doing stuff better with the dynamic turned off. Again, it's all your preference, and there's two school of thoughts, and there's two rival gangs about this. And I've heard some of the professionals do videos. I'm just right now pushing shift, by the way, and just smoothing everything out. And I've heard a lot of different ways of doing stuff. And if, it's funny. So if I come back up here to subtool, you'll see they're separated. Now, the one thing about ZBrush is there's a lot of stuff that's just all buried and nested, and we're going to get into some of the stuff, and some of the stuff you're not going to get a chance to get into. But let's go back here and look at this. The other way of doing stuff is when I build something in ZBrush, generally speaking, since everything is based on the mesh, when I take a look at this, and I'm going to hold Shift F again so we can see the resolution here. What I'm looking at is the amount of polys it's using. And if we can go up here and look at the 31,000, what I usually do is I want to get rid of my subdivisions, because even though I like going back in the beginning, usually I don't use it for that purpose. I'm going to delete the lower. So this is the actual resolution that we're seeing right here. It didn't change the number, it just didn't have it all still prepared to be subdivided. For us, for me, I use Dynamesh. Now, Dynamesh has some great stuff that goes on with it, but it's also got some other things that are a problem. I'm tempted to not talk about Dynamesh right now, but I'm going to touch on it just so you get an idea of what it is. So Dynamesh allows you to topologize everything you have here. But to get the real feel for what Dynamesh can do, well, actually, all it does is retop it. So if I come in here and I say, go down to Dynamesh, and I say 128, it's based on the size of the object in the world. So if I change this, and I say, let's just do 128 and see what it gets. It redefined it. It's actually twice as many polys. Okay, see that? And all it's doing, you'll notice it's not completely straight, and it's got some really interesting stuff, but it tries to keep loops. But all it's doing is it's dividing it based on the form of the object rather than based on just a generic thing. The problem with doing it the other way, let me go back to it. The problem with doing it the other way is that if I'm doing a really detailed area right inside of here, and let's say I use the Damien standard and I actually make it come up instead of out. Let me oops, get out of here. Come out. If I come out and then I say I want to do some real volume building, and let's say I do like this crazy amount of geometry right inside of here, and you see what happens. Since I only have a limited amount of geometry to work from when I'm first starting this, it doesn't add geometry. I can divide it again and it'll add geometry, and if we come back and look at F, you'll see it's got more geometry, but it's not adding geometry where I need it. It's adding it to the whole thing. So now the whole thing, if we go back, you'll see it's dividing the whole object, which is a complete waste of polys. We really just want the divisions to be in the area we may want them to be. I'm going to delete higher. The difference is if you go to Dynamesh, and we'll change it to 64, so it'll be half the resolution, and hopefully it'll be close to where it is right there. And I'll push Dynamesh, and it went to 18. That's hilarious. So we're going to say 80. All right, it's closer. Notice though, when I did that, here's the 31,000 tries or polys that we have, and if I push Dynamesh at 80, we'll do 90, and I push Dynamesh, watch what happens to this right here. It actually divides the object based on the forms. It's not now no longer, it's evenly dividing all the polys that it's using into this with this piece on here. So, oh wow, I didn't drop it down again, so let's go 90. There we go. So it's dividing it with this. Now, if I keep coming in here, the cool thing about Dynamesh when it's turned on is that when I come in here and I pull in some stuff, and look, I'm losing my resolution. If I hold Control and select off of the object and just drag anywhere, it doesn't have to be this big, I'm just showing you, and holding Select and then click, it remeshes the whole thing again. And now look how beautiful that is inside of there. If I take it and I say I want to flatten this out, let me turn off. I'm going to leave this on. Flatten this out. Let's say I want to do something like Snake Brush, which is a cool tool. Again, we can go B, S for snake, and then if you come down here, you can see Snake Brush. I think I have a shortcut for it, but I can't remember. Yeah. If you take Snake Brush, it does this. Okay. Well, there's a new tool we're going to have that makes that even better, but that's not quite what we want. Basically, if I pull this out, it's this. It's pulling all these pieces out. But if I Dynamesh it by clicking off and dragging again, it's now trying to define those edges. And if I smooth it, I'm just smoothing right now, the shift and rolling over the object. it's able to redefine the edges. So now I don't have to worry about all that weird stuff that's going on, and I can get this pretty fine inside of here. The other thing that we do is we have a new tool that came out in 2018, and I'm going to go back to standard. And that new tool in 2018 is up here. It's called Activate Sculptress Pro is the mode that we're talking about. So everything inside of ZBrush is based on verts, right? So it just redraws the verts and it tries to quad it up, and you can see what a really good job it does. Well, inside of Sculptress Pro, if I turn that on, it doesn't look like anything's happened. But what it's actually doing is now allowing me, depending on the size of the brush, and see it's purple now, depending on the size of the brush, it's going to add or subtract geometry as I need. What does that mean? Well, it means this. It's called tessimating and decimating. I'm going to turn this way down and draw a line right here. What the heck is that? It looks like a lot of geometry. Look at that. It's added all this geometry. Well, okay, so what do you mean by if I get bigger or smaller? Well, here's it is bigger. If I do that same thing, hold and just drag down, it's now less polys. See how much less it is? Depending on the size of the object or the brush is depending on how much resolution you get. One of the cool things you can do with this is I come over here and hold shift with that on, with Sculptress on, and just kind of delete stuff really fast for myself. On the opposite though too, if I come in here and hold shift and then like say turn the, by the way, turn the intensity down, ignore the RGB right now, turn the intensity down to 0, and I shrink the size of this and I hold shift, it's just adding geometry. Let me show you. If I turn this off, all I'm doing is adding geometry. I'm not really changing anything. You can't even see me doing anything, but I come back in here, you'll see I've got all this geometry. It's because the intensity was set to 0. Basically, I'm just telling it to up-res everything. I come back in here and I hold shift and it'll clean it up again. But look at that. It's all tries and weird stuff, and that's fine. That's totally fine. The cool thing is I have Dynamesh on. I can now click and drag and it retops it again back to quads if I want it to be. We can have a whole discussion on how important quads are and aren't. Now, one of the other things you're going to see is that, here, let me go to a really small point here. So I keep saying to you that everything is built off of verts inside of ZBrush. Well, if I try and draw with a really tiny brush with Sculptress on, it only works when it has verts to look at. Do you see how it didn't work? Every time I don't have a vert it's touching, or the brush size is touching, it stops showing me stuff. So sometimes you just want to add geometry back in to get some resolution in a certain area. Let's see, what else do we want? Let me turn off the F now. So Sculptress is really cool. The big, and this is again goes well for me. It goes well if I want to make something super. I keep my brush at the standard size and I just do this, and then I come in and I do this again, and it's even more resolution if we look at it. And then if I say, oh crap, I don't want it that big, I'm not even changing the resolution or the brush size. I'm just using what I have, and the smaller it is to the brush, the more resolution you're getting out of it. Now sometimes you want to make it bigger, but you know, right now it's being a poo face. And again, it's probably because I don't have enough verts to work with here. Oh, my intensity is 0. That's why. There we go. It's like, what is it doing? Okay. So that's the sculpting stuff. And then you can turn it off. And then you can turn it back on and redo it anytime you want. And there's more stuff like Z-Remesher and other tons of little things we're going to do, and we'll get into that. But for this prod thing, the last thing I want to talk about is that this color right here, well, let's talk about this right here. This is the default one it always starts with. It's the clay, red clay, or red wax, I mean, and it's cool. It's good stuff. But generally speaking, I jump over to something like a basic material, just so I can see a realistic or a more generic form for it. You know, I can get rid of all this stuff. And then, but, you know, it's fine either way you want to work. The only reason that this might be helpful is that it shows us a little bit more of what it would look like in a 3D model. But it's almost good to have 2 or 3 of these you can pop on, because you can see some different details inside of this that you don't see inside of the other way. Okay, the other thing is if you want to move an object around, you want to do a bunch of other stuff like that. We generally do that in here, but it's a little different. Oh, then there's one more thing too. Front, there's no front, but if I turn on X, if I just click X, what it does is symmetry. And what it means is it's going to take the center of the world, and if we look at this perspective, floor, it's the center of the world axis, and I come to here, it's the middle. So now when I sculpt, it's going to sculpt both sides, which gets pretty cool. What else can we do? Let's see. If I do that, we can also do the move tool. So if I don't have symmetry on and I move it, it comes up with this. I push W for move, just like in Max. And W, E, R don't matter. It doesn't really matter anymore for the basic move tool because those just open up the same tool. It's all one tool. But if I move it, I just grab these and I can move them around. And I'll talk about what that does in a second for the symmetry. And if I want to move it in more than one direction at a time, I can grab those corners. If I want to scale it, I use this right here, and I can scale all at once, or I can scale in two directions. One direction, I mean. Or I can rotate it by clicking on the wheel and just rotating it. And there's a bunch of other little tools inside of there, but that's really what you need to know. The only thing I want to make sure I point out is if I come over here, then I push X and go back to sculpting. Notice that the center point is off. So now even when I'm sculpting, it's not sculpting anymore. What gets even weirder is with symmetry on. Now I make sure it's on or off. And if you want to know, it's inside of here and it's activate symmetry, and now it's not active symmetry. Okay. But if I take this with symmetry on and I move it, I think I have symmetry on, yeah. And I scale it. Okay, then I move it. There we go. It's actually moving both parts of the same thing in two directions. Just realize if you see something weird like that happening, or something like this, it just means you have symmetry on. And if you push X, now it's gonna not do that. Of course, I probably wanted to not push X before I did that. And again, all you do is you go back to your other brushes and you're set. What else can we do? Let's talk about, there's also perspective, and it just makes it render a little bit cleaner. Let's talk about masking real quick too. There's a lot of power in the masking side of ZBrush. So kind of like Photoshop, you can mask, or even Substance, you can mask out a lot of the geometry or a lot of the stuff you want to do stuff to. So meaning that it won't do it to this, but it will do it to that. If we use mask and I just click outside of the object with Control selected, Control is the masking tool, and I go like this, it'll mask that whole section. Now when I sculpt, let me make it a little bit bigger here, it only sculpts what's not masked. Okay, let's say I want to unmask some stuff. Let me actually add some more resolution to this. Let's see, Dynamesh. There we go. So let's say I want to keep it masked, but I don't want it. I just want a line out of this mask, so I can do Alt. I have Control selected to mask, and then if I push Alt, you'll see it turns to a minus, and now it makes a white box, and it means I'm not masking those areas. And now when I sculpt, it's just going around those. I can also click outside of the object with Control on, and it will invert the selection. Invert. Okay. If I want to get rid of the mask after I'm done using it, I can also just click outside of the object and drag, and it will hide. It'll get rid of it. Another option is you don't have to mask always in perfect squares. There's other tools and stuff we can get into for that, but one of the things you can add by default is if you hold the Control button anytime and you roll over the object, you get a brush. So I can do it that way too. I can do it that and then turn on the Alt and get rid of this. So I'm Alt controlling the selection out of there. Let's say here, let's do something like this. And then I'll take it and do a little bit smaller for brush and do something. Actually, you know what? Let's do. Oops. That. I'm going to do this right here. And then I'll turn this smaller. I'll do that. Oops. I should tell you about that too. can get it pretty fine, and it's all depending on the resolution you have. So I'll turn this down a little bit more and push control so we can get some seeds in here. So get a watermelon. Now I can take my brush and do a larger brush on here, invert it, and then just kind of do this. Oops, wrong button. Kind of do this, and now I've got a really strong brush, so set to 100. And then if I smooth all of it, yeah, I probably wouldn't use this brush to do this, but let me turn this down. There you go. The other thing you can do with this tool is, if you saw by accident I showed you, if I click on the tool with control and it's already masked out, if I click it, it softens that. Here, let me undo this. If I click on the actual masked part with control selected, but just tap, it smooths out that blur. It blurs out the selection. If I hold Alt, Control, and tap, it tightens it up. So it's sharper and unsharp. So maybe I shouldn't have done that in here. So that's cool. What else? There's also hiding stuff. We'll get into that because in ZBrush's Infinite Wisdom, they decided to make two tools seem exactly, or use similar strokes but do different things. Yeah, I think that's about enough for us to talk about right now. This is the basics of ZBrush. If you bring something in here, you can just start carving once you've got it into the edit mode is the idea. The brushes you can change are up here. The tools you work on, which are the objects you import inside of here, are over here. And if you want to make something cool, then all you have to do is start sculpting, really. We can just come in here and say, okay, turn on symmetry. Oh, turn that strength way too low. I'll get from the top here. Right. My object is being weird. Okay, thanks. Yeah, let's do it this way. Snake. Oops. Let's do brush snake. I think it's 2. Let's do that X. It's really not what I was looking for here. I kind of messed up, so let's do X off. Flatten it with some inflate brush in this case. And then I'll creep out this thing here. Anyway, creepy stuff. It just takes some time to get used to it, and that's what you guys are going to be doing this week too. Before we get into our next stuff, I want you guys to play around with this. I want you to, and I'll go over the homework and stuff. This is just a horrifying, creepy little thing. So we'll do that, and I'll write up the instructions and go over it today. And we'll go from there.